The Hollowing. Chapter 1. The Bugs. The stale dungeon air clung to everything, as if it alone held the walls in place, daring the stones to catch their breath. An unnatural silence stood guard, a stifling reminder of how long he'd been held captive. Dampness invaded the burlap, weaving its way into the very core of the fabric. Oogie Boogie could feel the creeping emptiness, urging him to forget who he was and where he came from. A dark, unnatural magic. Even the shadows cast by the moon moved cautiously here, where once they had danced with the wisps and fae of this world of eternal night. The creatures who once flourished in the Kingdom of Twilight, now bent and deformed, no longer roamed freely between this realm and the world of men. After the transformation, they appeared as little more than insects, bugs, vermin to be trampled underfoot. Yet even here, in this forgotten place, Oogie cared for them. He had managed to tear a small hole in the shroud he had been wrapped in, so these creatures could find refuge in what was once his body. It took what little magic he could summon, but through the stones, carved deep with ancient runes, Oogie called upon a power to offer the last of his hope to those who had none. This ancient magic drew the bugs to him, the creatures who had once moved with elegance through the mystical world, now fleeing to find sanctuary in the tomb that was his prison. They sought refuge in Oogie. Few had survived the change. Those who did were warped in some way, drained, bent, twisted, hollow. The last 3 surviving children of the kingdom had escaped, saved by the love of their parents, who had forged them masks from the fading twilight as the old kingdom died. This magic concealed their true nature from Jack and his followers. Though shielded, they were not safe. The children realized what the bugs were and followed their trail as they cautiously swarmed past the swamp to the abandoned guard shack on the cliff above the prison. A sinister magic was the only sentry left to guard against escape. The boys managed to offer Oogie small comforts through the old piping system that ran to each cell. It had once been used to feed prisoners, though the last of them had vanished long before Oogie ascended the Twilight Throne. The boys offered what food they could spare, though Oogie could no longer eat. They offered him rare candles, though he could no longer feel warmth. And on the rarest of occasions, with a courage born of despair, they would sing through the pipes. It was these songs that reminded Oogie that he was still real. Through the cracks and through the stones, through runes carved deep with ancient bones, through the dark and through the fright, through the twisted black of night, through the whispering of the sacred winds that may never share their tales again, we will offer up with holy flame, we will sing forth your hallowed name. This we bear our final task, from behind our namesake's death shroud masks. In the desperate hours we call on thee, Oogeth on Boogeth on Ree. Though sung with love, each song would inevitably end with Jack's cruel laughter echoing in Oogie's head as he wondered if Sally was still out there somewhere. His mind filled with desperate visions, echoing cruelly through the fragments of his shattered mind, until once again the silence returned. Chapter 2. The Fall. The Kingdom of Twilight, though dark, held a subtle glow that spoke of balance, offering an eerie beauty unseen anywhere else. This was a place of nature's magic, where the forces that laid the first stones dwelt, a place where the unseen would come to seek rest. Oogie Boogie ruled not over the forces of nature, but alongside them, a king whose people embraced the strange and macabre with a holy reverence. Under his reign, the kingdom thrived with creatures of the in-between, specters of the evening, wisps and fairies. It was hard to say exactly what Sally was, but there was no denying her beauty, no matter the form she took. Some say that's what first twisted Jack. Legends before the fall tell of a time when Jack, still a mortal man, saw Sally bathing in human form one night, moonlight dancing on the water as it flowed over her skin. Bewitched by her beauty, Jack followed her, clawing his way through the veil that separated their worlds. Men were never meant to cross into the Kingdom of Twilight, but Jack was relentless. When he emerged on the other side, he was neither fully alive, nor was he fully dead. The magic of the human world had pulled him, while the magic of the Twilight Kingdom fought to push him back, tearing at parts of him. As he forced his way through, the opposing forces twisted together, transforming him into something new, something terrible. These twisted magics now emanated from Jack. Upon reaching the other side, he realized he had changed, horribly disfigured, his body and soul reshaped by the magics of both realms. Unable to bear his new form, Jack hollowed out a pumpkin, carving it to hide his tormented, misshapen head. Being from the human world, Jack could not escape his thirsts. Jack sought power and possession, concepts foreign to this kingdom. Sally, as elusive in her own world as she was in the realms beyond, was difficult to ensnare, except in one place, the Twilight Palace. Oogie and Sally were to be wed. In Oogie's presence, Sally found peace, a stillness that soothed her wandering nature. Not forever, but for a time. When Sally was with Oogie, they would walk among the creatures of the She and dance in the shadowed courtyards. Oogie and Sally were in love. Jack was enraged when he discovered this, and sought the aid of a sorcerer to help him capture his prey. Jack was clever, but his new magics were foreign and unwieldy, and so he befriended Finn Kelstein, a curious soul. Through their friendship, Jack slowly warped the sorcerer, tempting Finn with talk of sciences from the human world. Gradually, Finn became bent and crippled by Jack's influence, unable to remember the ways of the Kingdom of Twilight. Despite Jack's brokenness, he was charming, but Oogie Boogie saw through it. He knew the darkness in Jack's heart, the hunger for power that would consume the kingdom. Jack, however, was patient. He twisted those he touched and hollowed those he could not, gradually rallying those who sought power through fear and sowing dissent among Oogie's followers. Whispers of the great hollowing echoed through the streets, turning friends into foes. It wasn't long before Jack, with his growing influence in dark magic, confronted Oogie Boogie. Their battle was fierce, a clash of old magic against the new darkness that emanated from Jack. But Jack's power was drawn from something far more malevolent than Oogie had ever encountered. In a final act of desperation, Jack did his worst. He cast a spell that would either extinguish Sally's existence or strip Oogie Boogie of his form. For the king of this Twilight realm, it was an easy choice. Oogie fell, torn from his body, his essence pooling on the cold stones of the palace floor. Jack bound Oogie in an enchanted burlap shroud, an eternal prison where what was left of him would wither away as his power faded like a forgotten memory. This was Finn's latest invention, a cruel creation. Oogie's essence, a king in fragments, lingered, but he could no longer rule, only cling to existence in the hollow of a sack. Jack cast him into a prison forged before memory, and then quickly set his sights on Sally. The Kingdom of Twilight twisted along with all of its subjects. Those who refused to be twisted were hollowed. With the population decimated and the kingdom's landscape laid to waste, the survivors cobbled together a new town, named after the great hollowing, Hollowing Town. Jack, now the Pumpkin King, ruled over this land. The mystical beauty it once held, gone, replaced by fear. Its people now subjects to Jack's endless thirst for control, while Oogie Boogie locked away, unable to even watch as the kingdom he loved decay into darkness. Chapter 3. The Doll. Sally watched, frozen in one terrible moment, as her love was ripped from his body and sealed in a mystical shroud of coarse cloth and cast into darkness. A scene that felt like a lifetime. She hopelessly watched her one true love forever fall from grace. She thought he'd been killed. The bundle that was now Oogie was lifelessly dragged through the broken streets. Sally saw what was left of him, taken away, and then she collapsed. When she awoke, Sally found herself strapped to a rough wooden table, cold metal bands pinning her down. The wrought iron hugged her like cloth, but it was immovable. She felt strange, somehow not herself. As her faculties slowly returned, she saw Finn Kelstein and the Pumpkin King drawing closer. Though she struggled to understand their words through her drug-induced haze, she could tell they were talking about her as if she weren't even in the room. Something wasn't right. Finn approached and gently covered her face with a cloth. The acrid smell swallowed her, bitter, sour, and biting. The chemicals pulled her back into the oblivion she was desperately trying to escape. Had she been able to understand the conversation, she would have heard Finn, now the newly appointed doctor of Hollowing Town, describing how he'd painstakingly removed pieces from half a dozen corpses. Bits and pieces of freshly slain witches from the world of men to replace the parts of Sally that made her difficult. Once they had finished, Sally, a distant shadow of her former self, was little more than a walking, talking rag doll. Sewn together at the joints, her limbs were foreign and awkward. Her power was gone. Sally would wonder no more. Chapter 4. The Turning. The days passed slowly as Hollowing Town found its place in the world. Knowing Sally was powerless to leave, Jack allowed his focus to shift to other matters. He learned that, for kingdoms like his, belief was the fuel that sustained their magic. Belief from the human world fueled the mystical outer realms, and in return, the realms provided the wonder that fed that belief. It was their cycle of life. Once a year, as the summer ended, the veil between their worlds was thinnest. Jack knew he had to exploit this anomaly, to pull back the curtain and allow the denizens of Hollowing Town to terrify humanity. But as time passed, the mortals grew wise. Every year during this time, they adorned themselves with masks and costumes, mimicking the Hollow folk. It was a ritual designed to protect themselves, offering them a way to blend in, as if they too were creatures from beyond the mystical barrier. Before the change, the subjects of the Kingdom of Twilight had never concerned themselves with time of year. While the thinning of the veil has always been tempting, their kingdom had offered them the freedom to move unhindered between worlds year-round. But under Jack's rule, this shift forced them into violence and cruelty, and so the humans ritualized this night as a defense, in turn offering Jack the power needed to grow. Yet despite his increasing strength each year, it was not enough. Chapter 5. The Engagement. Time moved differently beyond the mortal realm. In the lands of myths and legends, where ghosts and gods dwelt, time was but another kingdom, a force whose influence on the human world was as real as any other mystical force. For the kingdoms beyond the veil, if time was counted at all, it was measured in the seasons of men. Years passed for these realms, feeling like the fleeting cycles of the moon to the humans. And in this timeless place, knowing Sally could not escape his influence, Jack set his sights on conquest, his plan for marriage. There was no magic in Hollowing Town, nor any science that Dr. Finn Kelstein could wield to make Sally love another. But Jack, having come from the world of men, had brought with him not only twisted sciences, but also the logic of man's reason. And in his twisted heart, Jack convinced himself that love could be won, if only he had more power. His greed consumed him, warping his desires, until he convinced himself that if he only possessed enough, Sally's love would follow. He set his gaze on the kingdom to the north, beyond the frozen mountains, and through the great evergreen gates. Conquering it, he thought, would prove his worth, and secure Sally's devotion. Jack began his preparations. He summoned all the denizens of Hollowing Town and set them to their tasks. But Sally's fate was not yet sealed. Though her body was imprisoned, her spirit remained unbroken. Jack knew that to truly possess her, he had to not only chain her physically, but also bend her will. The engagement to be married was just another link in that chain, a promise of power and dominance disguised as a future together. In Jack's mind, there would be no stopping this union. He had vanquished Oogie Boogie. He had taken power here. And as long as he ruled, he believed there was nothing that could prevent their wedding. Chapter 6. Sally's Struggle. As time passed, Jack's latest obsession kept him occupied. Rumors of spies and captives swirled around Hollowing Town. The air was tense with hushed whispers of war with the Northern Kingdom and its inhabitants known as the Azir. It was said they were a fierce and dangerous enemy with magics of their own. This was the land where the gods of the Vikings dwelt. Jack was plotting a way around an all-out war. A war he would surely lose, but he had come too far to turn back now. With Dr. Kelstein as his consul, Jack laid his plans for a different kind of siege. Treachery was his only path forward. Sally managed to slide into the shadows in Hollowing Town, exploring her new form and the magic that came with it. She no longer possessed the ability to shift from one appearance to the next, but she found that when she pulled the threads that held her new body together, her limbs could do her bidding without being attached. And though she no longer crossed the veil into other worlds, her new hands remembered the secrets from their former owners. The parts of the witches she was cobbled together from gave her new strength, and Jack's neglect allowed her the time she needed to explore it. Dr. Kelstein would check in on her from time to time, often locking her away and forgetting where. Sometimes Sally would sit in solitude and mourn the loss of Oogie. Sometimes she would escape without the distracted Kelstein noticing. He was twisted and brutal, and he enjoyed experimenting on her and her new form. Some of the doctor's tests were to explore her abilities, which Sally fought to hide despite the pain he would inflict. Some were meant to explore how her new form worked, how it moved, and how it reacted to various sensations: smell, touch, taste, and as always, pain. Finn knew he would eventually be tasked with giving Jack a more desirable visage, and wanted to be prepared for this inevitability. But Sally had grown used to Finn's invasions. Though twisted and cruel, he lacked Jack's brutality, Jack's love of inflicting horrors. Her true fear lay in Jack once again turning his attention to her. As her power grew, Sally knew she had to stop Jack, and the only way to make that happen was for him to somehow lose this war. Chapter 7. Sally's Hope. Hollowing Town surged with an uneasy ebb and flow. The mix of chaos and secrecy that plagued the town made it hard to know how to sabotage Jack's plan. She wanted desperately to warn the Asir to the north, but she was no longer able to cross over to another realm. She had to find a way without raising suspicion, but everyone and everything seemed suspicious now. Anyone she tried to approach would just turn a cold shoulder, too afraid of Jack's wrath to be seen with her. Jack's jealousy had caused him to destroy Oogie and his entire kingdom. What might he do to a common citizen? She once made the mistake of trying to ask Dr. Kelstein about what was going on. His eyes almost twinkled at this new development with his favorite experiment. That was the time he removed the top of her head and experimented with different parts of her brain while asking her questions, a torment that would likely always haunt her. In the end, she learned nothing of what was happening with Jack's plan. She only ever saw Jack when she was strapped to a table in the lab, when he would occasionally peer through the bars of a cage Kelstein had locked her in, while giving Jack a report of his latest findings. Eventually, Sally realized that her only hope to discover his plan would be for her to sneak into the castle and spy on Jack herself. She feared what would happen if she were caught, but realized that between Finn Kelstein's lab and the inevitability of her marriage with Jack, the worst was going to find her anyway. Her only way out was through. During her time in Finn's lab, when he'd leave her unattended and forget to lock her in, she would experiment with what she could find. There were bottles and vials she'd never seen before, but when she read the labels or smelled their contents, memories not her own would fill her mind from places she'd never seen. The witches they'd used to make Sally's new body were powerful. They had to be, for Finn to be able to carry their corpses back across the veil in good enough condition to be used for his unnatural purposes. When their bodies were charged with her essence, they combined to make something new and beautiful. No matter what form Sally took, she was always beautiful. Sally realized that she could mix precise potions, summon plants to grow, and had a constant nagging in her fingertips to sew. She'd never done any of this before the change, but now it was second nature to her. She experimented with the rough cloth that Oogie had finally been sealed in. It was a curious design, created to ensnare. It was hard to work with, but she found that she could make little dolls, fill them with vines, and infuse them with a potion that would allow them to grow within the sackcloth bodies. But vines needed room to grow, or they'll smother and die. She could animate her dolls in this way for a short time, but they would eventually suffocate and fall back to the ground, lifeless and devoid of magic. Chapter 8. A Crack in the Veneer. Sally had soon mastered her newfound gifts. She would use them to sneak into the throne room. She spent what would have been several months, to a human, summoning vines to grow to cover every inch of Hollowing Town. They invaded the castle and smothered the courtyard. Then they moved into the halls and crept into the rooms until Jack's throne itself was covered in vines. Jack had no time for gardening and couldn't spare a single soldier, for all but Sally were conscripted into the Hollow Army. Jack had a kingdom to overthrow. He had no time for the trivialities of tending to these weeds. Once the town was engulfed in its new growth, Sally sewed a burlap cloak infused with vines so that when she donned her new garment, she could blend into any of the vegetation that covered the city and the castle, inside and out. With a little practice, she found that she could even climb the walls within the palace without being noticed. Anywhere the new growth reached, Sally could hide. From the moment she first made it into the throne room and found her perch on the wall high above the throne that had once belonged to Oogie, she began to tremble. Partly from rage at the usurper who'd slain her love, and partly from the fear that Jack would find her out. Part of her just knew that Jack could sense her, that he knew she was waiting and watching. Sally had feared that the moment she might learn something of use, Jack would spin his unnatural head 180 degrees behind him, and then slowly look up to where she was. He'd then seize her and throw her into a torment that would never end. But that was just a fear. It's not uncommon to imagine your enemies as more powerful than they are, especially when they seem to have the upper hand. But despite her fears, she had found her perch, and there she stayed, day in and day out, watching as Jack would order the creation of various inventions that he and Dr. Kelstein would dream up based on what their spies would report back to them about the North. Little of what went on made any sense to Sally. The warped and deranged minds running Hollowing Town were planning to lay siege to a world they clearly did not understand. But then the day came when a prisoner was brought in, a man wrapped in a red cloak and bound with mystical irons. He was a giant compared to Jack. His voice was deep and powerful. Sally half expected this captive to break his irons with a twitch of his wrists and command the castle walls to crumble with a shout from his mighty chest. He did not. He stood stone still before this pumpkin king. Even when Jack's temper turned to violence when the captive refused to answer Jack's questions, the man stood unflinching in the face of the most terrifying and brutal ruler this land had ever known. Jack had begun striking his prisoner as if he were chopping down a tree, but stopped as abruptly as he had started. The captive held no fear of Jack, and for the first time since his battle with Oogie, Sally saw something she'd only seen once before. Jack began to tremble, ever so slightly. Jack ordered him to be taken away and placed with the others. Sally didn't know where he'd be taken or how many others there would be, but she knew she had to follow. This had to be the opportunity she needed. Chapter 9. The Hidden Place. As Jack ordered the prisoner away, he stormed out of the room in the direction of his private chambers. Sally knew this because they were once Oogie's private chambers, where she'd spent countless hours with her love. She forced her mind to go blank as she moved down the wall and out into the hallway. She was following the prisoner, heading in the opposite direction Jack had gone. Though this should have made her feel safe, it did not. She forced herself to go numb, convinced it was a trap, that Jack would have taken the secret hallway from the private chambers to the great stone statue in the courtyard. Just as Sally would pass the colossal tribute to the Fairy King, Jack would spring out and grab her. She willed her thoughts to be quiet as she awaited what she had feared most. The stitches that held her together grew tight, but that moment never came for Sally. She moved down the hall and through the courtyard with no sign of a trap. She moved silently along the trails as his captive in red, escorted by Jack's hollowed-out minions, moved through the swamps to the edge of the realm. They traveled so far out that Sally feared they would cross the threshold to the places she could not follow. But there, at the edge of her world, she saw them disappear below the cliff edge. Sally quietly waited, still not convinced Jack wasn't waiting around the corner, Kelstingen at his side, ready to punish her for the rest of her existence. When Jack's sentries resurfaced from beyond the cliff face and started back toward town, Sally made her move. She did not have the luxury of the cover from the overgrowth she'd created in town. Her magic hadn't stretched that far. She swiftly moved out of the trees she'd used for cover and onto the path that led her past the guardhouse and over the cliff edge. As she passed the dilapidated building, she noticed a light through the foggy window, a small hovel where the wardens of this prison undoubtedly lived. She had slipped past the guards' quarters unnoticed and descended the concrete steps to the entrance of the dungeon below. This is where she would find all of Hollowing Town's captives. Jack had imprisoned at least 30 Asir since their conflict had begun. While not all the citizens of this kingdom were as imposing as the man in the red cloak, they were all warriors, hard men from a cold place. Many had been here for a long, long time. They lived on what food the 3 boys living in the guardhouse above could spare. Their food was rationed and scarce, so the prisoners that had been here the longest were the weakest. Their energy was low, and their minds ensnared in a prison where the magics at play made them oblivious to those in the cells next to them. Each prisoner that entered these walls in chains saw an empty and hopeless place devoid of light and life, except for the bugs. Curious creatures that mainly kept to one cell, but would venture out when new arrivals would come. The prisoners would sit alone in the cold, damp cells and wait for random rations to be dropped from the pipes above. The Asir did not understand the songs that were sung, but they felt power in them, a belief that made them hope for freedom. As Sally surveyed the cells, she felt her world pause as it did the day she saw Oogie ripped apart by Jack's evil magic. There, in the corner of one of the cells, She saw Oogie's burlap shroud. Though nothing of his previous form remained, she realized in that moment that she would always know him, regardless of his appearance. As she stood there trembling, she fought back the hope that he was still alive, because that hope would be too much to bear if it were not true. Though she tried to push it down, the hope still swelled within her. And then the bugs came. Chapter 10. The Battle. From the cracks in the walls and the gaps in the floors, anywhere there was a space, these insects surged into the cell, swarming the burlap pile in the corner. At first, she began to shake in horror, thinking they'd come to devour him. But Sally would soon realize that they were animating him, slowly bringing him back to life. The burlap shroud became taut as it mimicked the form Oogie possessed before the change. Could this be real? Sally thought to herself, as Oogie slowly came to his full height and looked at her. Though he had no eyes, there was a glow through the sack where his eyes would have been. His essence was still there, still holding on for the sake of his subjects that now gave him life. Now, in her presence, the hope that had overwhelmed Sally was spilling over into Oogie. That hope became his new strength. Oogie told Sally to head to the guardhouse above the prison and tell the boys she would find there that the day had finally come. In a moment, she returned with all three in tow. Quickly, they formulated a plan, a dangerous plan. Only Jack possessed the key to open the doors. Anyone could imprison someone here, but only the key would set them free. They all knew what had to be done. Setting the wheels in motion, Sally removed the stitching from her right arm, the one with the markings from the human world that made it hard not to recognize her new form. Her arm was placed in the cell with Oogie. The bugs would leave his form to make him look small and weak. Sally's arm was positioned to make it appear as though she was under Oogie's burlap, with her hand moving in a constant caress. Oogie, Sally, and the two of the boys, Shock and Barrel, hid, lying in wait to spring on Jack and imprison him in his cage. The third boy, Locke, would go to find Jack and inform him of Sally's treachery. It seemed like an eternity waiting for Jack. Would he come himself? Would he even be at the castle? Or would he be scouting the Northlands? Would he kill Locke in a jealous rage? Would he spend a month torturing him before sending his hollow soldiers to deal with the issue? The plan seemed to go well at first. When Jack received the news, he'd flown out of the palace with the fury of a bolt of lightning. Before they could realize what was happening, Jack had made it to the cliffs and was in the prison corridor with little warning, aside from an ethereal growl that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. So enraged was Jack that he crushed the prison key in his shaking fist. As the key broke, so did the magic that was holding the cells closed, the magic that made the prisoners invisible to one another. In his enraged state, Jack hadn't thought about the consequences of breaking the key. At the same time, Oogie, Sally, and the boys hadn't stopped to consider what would happen without the ability to lock Jack away. They had only planned to fight him off long enough to trap him in his own cell. No one was ready to fight Jack to the death. As the cells sprang open, several of the Asir snapped out of their prison-induced trances. They saw the battle taking place in the corner cell, a battle between what looked like monsters and boys in masks, all being swarmed by prison bugs. The Asir that had strength left in them weren't sure what to make of the battle, but they knew their enemy, Jack, the Skeleton King. 10 of the Asir rushed the cell in a coordinated effort that looked almost rehearsed. They grabbed Jack and dragged him to the edge of the prison corridor, to the steps overlooking the cliff's edge. Later, they would think it strange that as they drug him to his death, he just laughed in horrific glee. His only concern was the burlap bundle he had ruthlessly clung to, tearing it to pieces as he gnashed the fleeing bugs between his teeth. They had taken Jack to the edge of the cliff, smashed his bones to bits, and thrown all but his head over the edge. His cracked and broken skull they took back to the north to post at their southern border. This was to serve as a reminder for whomever might wonder from their hollow place what would happen if they dared to overreach their boundaries. They had no idea that as Jack was being dragged to his demise, he had finally managed to kill the true king of the Twilight Realm, leaving the kingdom so broken it might never heal. Chapter 10. The Battle. From the cracks in the walls and the gaps in the floors, anywhere there was a space, these insects surged into the cell, swarming the burlap pile in the corner. At first, she began to shake in horror, thinking they'd come to devour him, but Sally would soon realize that they were animating him, slowly bringing him back to life. The burlap shroud became taut as it mimicked the form Oogie possessed before the change. Could this be real? Sally thought to herself, as Oogie slowly came to his full height and looked at her. Though he had no eyes, there was a glow through the sack where his eyes would have been. His essence was still there, still holding on for the sake of his subjects that now gave him life. Now, in her presence, the hope that had overwhelmed Sally was spilling over into Oogie. That hope became his new strength. Oogie told Sally to head to the guardhouse above the prison and tell the boys she would find there that the day had finally come. In a moment, she returned with all three in tow. Quickly, they formulated a plan, a dangerous plan. Only Jack possessed the key to open the doors. Anyone could imprison someone here, but only the key would set them free. They all knew what had to be done. Setting the wheels in motion, Sally removed the stitching from her right arm, the one with the markings from the human world that made it hard not to recognize her new form. Her arm was placed in the cell with Oogie. The bugs would leave his form to make him look small and weak. Sally's arm was positioned to make it appear as though she was under Oogie's burlap, with her hand moving in a constant caress. Oogie, Sally, and the two of the boys, Shock and Barrel, hid, lying in wait to spring on Jack and imprison him in his cage. The third boy, Locke, would go to find Jack and inform him of Sally's treachery. It seemed like an eternity waiting for Jack. Would he come himself? Would he even be at the castle? Or would he be scouting the Northlands? Would he kill Locke in a jealous rage? Would he spend a month torturing him before sending his hollow soldiers to deal with the issue? The plan seemed to go well at first. When Jack received the news, he'd flown out of the palace with the fury of a bolt of lightning. Before they could realize what was happening, Jack had made it to the cliffs and was in the prison corridor with little warning, aside from an ethereal growl that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. So enraged was Jack that he crushed the prison key in his shaking fist. As the key broke, so did the magic that was holding the cells closed, the magic that made the prisoners invisible to one another. In his enraged state, Jack hadn't thought about the consequences of breaking the key. At the same time, Oogie, Sally, and the boys hadn't stopped to consider what would happen without the ability to lock Jack away. They had only planned to fight him off long enough to trap him in his own cell. No one was ready to fight Jack to the death. As the cells sprang open, several of the Asir snapped out of their prison-induced trances. They saw the battle taking place in the corner cell, a battle between what looked like monsters and boys in masks, all being swarmed by prison bugs. The Asir that had strength left in them weren't sure what to make of the battle, but they knew their enemy, Jack, the Skeleton King. 10 of the Asir rushed the cell in a coordinated effort that looked almost rehearsed. They grabbed Jack and dragged him to the edge of the prison corridor, to the steps overlooking the cliff's edge. Later, they would think it strange that as they drug him to his death, he just laughed in horrific glee. His only concern was the burlap bundle he had ruthlessly clung to, tearing it to pieces as he gnashed the fleeing bugs between his teeth. They had taken Jack to the edge of the cliff, smashed his bones to bits, and thrown all but his head over the edge. His cracked and broken skull they took back to the north to post at their southern border. This was to serve as a reminder for whomever might wonder from their hollow place what would happen if they dared to overreach their boundaries. They had no idea that as Jack was being dragged to his demise, he had finally managed to kill the true king of the Twilight Realm, leaving the kingdom so broken it might never heal. Chapter 11. The Final Thread. It had been so long since Sally had danced with her love in the courtyard, or walked among the veils that separated worlds, that it was hard for her to remember if any of it were even real. As she watched the pieces of burlap swirl in the wind, roused by the commotion of so many men working in unison to introduce Jack to his final fate, she remembered that eternal moment when she had watched as Oogie was torn from his body and sealed in that wretched cloth. Lost in both moments, she numbly scrambled to gather the bits of Oogie's shroud, making sure to collect every last piece. Sally bundled them together and wept. Oblivious to the world around her, she sat and cradled the last memory of Oogathon-Boogeth, ruler of the Kingdom of Twilight. She sat alone in the stone corridor, among the empty prison cells for days. It was the cold that finally roused her from her trance. An empty, cold expanse had begun to fill the abandoned prison, as the last magic had finally faded from it, drained like sand in a broken hourglass. She awoke as if from a dream, though she had not slept. The growing emptiness made her feel that it had all been real. From her love for her king, to Jack's cruel reign, and then discovering that Oogie was alive, only to lose him again that same day. That thought was more than she could bear. Slowly, Sally rose from her place on the floor, still holding the bundle of rags as though it were something immeasurably fragile. As if in a fog, she rose and left this place of final sorrows. She retreated deep into the swamp, far from prying eyes, and on a small island in the middle of a bog, she sat and arranged the pieces of Oogie. Softly, she began to hum a tune she'd never heard before, as she pulled the sewing needle from her pocket. Sally somehow felt comforted, as if the souls of the bodies she had come to inhabit were there with her, offering her comfort. She began plucking long strands of her hair from her head and twisting them into a thread that matched her own stitching. Her hands knew their business. They began sewing the shroud back together. After destroying as much of Jack as they could, the Asir gathered their brothers, who were too weak to walk, from the now open cells, and made their way home in silence. The three boys had watched in horror as it all went wrong, never imagining their plan would unfold this way. Oogie and Jack both dead, Sally broken on the floor. All hope seemed lost. Over the days that followed, they would check on Sally, trying to get her to join them in their guardhouse in the warmth of the home they'd made. But Sally didn't seem to see them. Though she knelt right in front of them, she was at the same time somewhere far away. They took turns keeping watch over her personal bodyguards. The bugs were nearly all gone now, and as the last few stragglers scurried away, Sally finally stirred. Silently, without acknowledging any of the boys, she rose and retreated to the swamplands. They took turns watching over her in this place too, half watching Sally from a distance, half standing guard against the hollow men. Sally would not speak to anyone. She simply sat and sang a soft melody in a language they could not understand, and she sewed. At the beginning of the third day,
The boys gathered in the swamp, again noticing a trail beginning to form, like the one that had led them to Oogie in the prison after the change. The bugs were once again swarming together, but unlike the last time, they emitted a strange glow, twisting and winding their way through the trees, winding their way to Sally.